I know that pattern making can seem really tricky, and even just understanding where to start can feel really overwhelming. Hey guys, I'm Tammy and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to share 7 different pattern making tips I wish I had known at the start of my journey. Now, I'm a self-taught sewist and I learned everything I know from just trial and error. I personally don't believe you need a formal education to get started. Pattern making is such a fun skill to learn, and honestly, once you get started, things do become a lot easier as you understand the process a bit more. So if you want to learn how to start pattern making in a more easy and digestible way, then these 7 tips are going to be perfect for you. My first tip is to clone your clothes instead of using blocks. If you've heard of pattern making blocks before, they're essentially different shapes that you can use to help draft specific sewing patterns. So you can make things like a pant block or a bodice block or a skirt block, and then you manipulate that to make a sewing pattern out of it. Blocks in general are actually really hard to get right because you need to be really specific with the measurements to make sure it fits you correctly. Now, instead of doing this, you can definitely just go into your own wardrobe and look at clothes you already have to recreate them. This is also known as cloning your own clothes, and it's a really useful skill because basically you can take items of clothing that you already have in your wardrobe and you know that fits you really well and use that to create a sewing pattern from that. So let's say I have a pair of shorts in my wardrobe that I already really like. I can just use the shorts and trace over the basic shape of the shorts to create the front and back pattern pieces. Now, in general, you want to use clothes that are easier to recreate. So things like an elasticated waistband will be much easier than fitted pairs of shorts. You can even use what you've traced to create blocks for yourself because you already know that that specific garment fits you, and you can manipulate it and adjust it to create a block for your own body. It's honestly such an easy method to try, and it's a really great way to understand the fundamentals of constructing a specific garment. My second tip, if you only want to buy one book, is this book right here, and it's Pattern Making for Fashion Design by Helen Joseph Armstrong. Now, this book is absolutely massive. As you can see, there's so many different pages. It's really heavy as well, but it's a really thorough book for learning how to draft blocks and manipulating them. Now, like I said in my first tip, drafting blocks can be really time consuming, so getting a really thorough book like this is going to be so essential for learning that. If I just go to any page, let's just go to a random one. Here we've got one for how to draft low waist skirts. So you can see it has lots of different diagrams and instructions on how to do that. So in this scenario, you would draft a skirt block and then you would manipulate it to create a low waist option. So it's a really great book and it has everything you need to know inside this. There are other books that I definitely use all the time for grading and pattern making, but if you're just going to buy one, I definitely recommend that one. Tip number 3 is if you're struggling to understand how different construction methods work for each garment, I personally would buy a garment online that is really similar to the one you're trying to recreate. So for example, if I'm making a specific skirt, I'll go online and buy different skirts that have that style, and then I'll look inside the garments and just see how they differ inside because the construction methods will all be different. And this is just really useful to understand which ones you prefer the look of, but also which ones look easier to recreate. I also like this process of looking inside existing ready-to-wear garments to assess how they've been constructed because it takes a lot of the guesswork out on my end, and I can also see which ones lie the best. And also, part of my sewing patterns are meant to be very beginner friendly, so I get to see the insides of which ones look easier to construct. Tip number 4 is that you don't have to do everything yourself. I feel like it's a really big misconception that when it comes to sewing pattern making, you have to do every part of the process on your own, and I just think that's simply not true. So many brands, including myself, outsource different parts of the process to people that are much more qualified in that specific area. So when I first started making my own sewing patterns, I really couldn't wrap my head around how grading works, and it's one of the key things a lot of people outsource when they're making their first sewing patterns because it can be so tricky to understand. I personally used to work with a sewing pattern grader, and I would make a size 8, give it to them, and they would grade it for the rest of the sizes, and it was a lot easier to do when you don't understand the fundamentals. Now obviously I have a much more understanding of how that works and I am able to grade my own sewing patterns, but I think it's really important to understand that you're not expected to do everything yourself, and it's completely fine to outsource parts that you're less comfortable with. This doesn't even have to be grading. It could be processes like editing your final images or even testing mock-ups and toiles if you don't want to do that yourself. These are different things that you can definitely outsource. You just have to find the right team. I actually created a free sewing pattern business roadmap that I'm going to link down below, and it goes through my entire process from start to finish of making and selling a sewing pattern, so you can use it as a guide to understand understand which part of these you might need help with and which ones you could ultimately outsource. Tip number 5 is to learn how to use Adobe Illustrator. Honestly, I find drafting sewing patterns on Adobe Illustrator is so much easier than doing it by hand with pen and paper. If you've never heard of Adobe Illustrator before, it's basically a graphic design tool, and you can also use it for pattern making and lots of different things like that. And it's just a really easy way to draft sewing patterns digitally rather than by doing it by hand. My professional background is actually in graphic design, and Adobe software is what I use at university and it's what I use in my graphic design career. And when I started to understand that you could use this to draft sewing patterns, it is such a game changer. So things like you can draft a block on Adobe Illustrator and then actually manipulate that block on Adobe Illustrator as well. So it saves a lot of paper wastage when it comes to making and altering your sewing patterns. If you prefer drafting sewing patterns by hand, you'll still need to know how to use Adobe Illustrator because you need to digitize them so it's easier for people to print. If you've never used Adobe Illustrator before, I do have a course down below that I'll link, and in that course I go through how to use Adobe Illustrator for sewing patterns. My 6th tip is to not underestimate the importance of testing your sewing patterns before it goes to market. Whenever I'm making a sewing pattern, I always test the garment on my mum or a family member that's bigger than I am so I can understand how it fits them before I then go ahead and give it out to other testers. This is also known as having a fit model, and it just means you can iron out any big issues before it goes out to everyone else that has different body shapes. Even just making multiple toiles of your garment in different fabric types will also help you test it to see how different fabrics work with your style. Making sure I have a wide range of testers when it comes to testing my sewing patterns always makes me so much less stressed out when it comes to launch. My last pattern making tip is to try different methods and see which one works for you. There are so many different ways that you can use to draft and start making your own sewing patterns, and ultimately you want to try them all to understand what works for you and also which ones you prefer. You might have noticed I have a mannequin right behind me, and that's a way you can learn how to draft your own sewing patterns. You can literally drape fabric onto a mannequin and see how that fits the body and then use that to give yourself a sewing pattern. There's honestly no right way when it comes to drafting your own sewing patterns. It just takes a lot of trial and error for you to play and see which ones you actually prefer the most. And also taking other people's suggestions as a guide, not as a rule. Like that book that I showed you in the beginning of the Helen Joseph Armstrong book, that's a great book. There's so many different pattern making books out there that might explain things in a more digestible and easy way for you to understand. Even little things like if you picked up one of those pattern drafting books before, maybe a year or two ago, and you tried making a block and it just didn't make any sense, I would definitely encourage you to try it again now, because you might have found in the past couple years your natural sewing skills might have developed and you might have a better understanding of how to draft them now as you did maybe 1 or 2 years ago. So those are 7 pattern making tips I wish I had known sooner. I hope they're really helpful for you to understand how to get into the world of pattern making and also to make your processes a lot easier. I have created a new course that goes through step by step my entire process of making sewing patterns and then selling them online. I'll make sure to leave that down below in the description box. I'll also leave a link down below for the free sewing pattern business roadmap I talked about as well. Again, that outlines all the steps you need to think about when it comes to making your first sewing pattern. Honestly, when it comes to making sewing patterns, you just have to start from somewhere, and it will just take a lot of trial and error on your end to play and continue to experiment. Definitely start with something simple to begin with, because it will make the entire process a lot more easy to understand than going in with something more complicated. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.